Michael had driven the same route for 20 years without asking a single question about his own life. Every morning, before dawn, he arrived at Millbrook Station with the precision of a man who had given up on surprises. But the day Thomas stepped off that train, everything changed. What started as a simple 2-week employment became the most dangerous investment of Michael's life, not in money, but in hope. By the end, Michael would have to choose between the life he knew and the life he could become. And sometimes that choice comes with a price nobody expects to pay.
Quick pause. Before we continue, tell us, where in the world are you watching from? If you're enjoying these stories, make sure to hit subscribe, because tomorrow's episode is absolutely mind-blowing.
The station platform was empty, except for the pigeons huddled against the cold and a lone stray dog searching for scraps. Michael stood beside his horse-drawn carriage, checking the harness for what must have been the 100th time that morning. The leather was worn but strong, much like Michael himself. He was 42 years old, though the weathered lines of his face made him look older. His skin had the color of a man who spent his days in the open air without ever feeling the sun's warmth on his soul. His hands were calloused from decades of gripping reins, his back permanently bent from years of reaching for luggage and cargo that never changed, never surprised, never offered anything beyond the mechanical repetition of movement. 20 years. That's how long Michael had been driving carriages at Millbrook Station, a small town nestled between the industrial cities of the Northeast and the slower pace of rural America. The year was 1887, and the world was transforming around him in ways he could barely comprehend. Steam engines were becoming more powerful with each passing year. Electric lights flickered in the wealthy parts of the city, casting an eerie glow that seemed to mock the horse-drawn carriages that still dominated the transportation landscape. Somewhere in the distance, inventors were dreaming of horseless carriages, of machines that would carry people faster and farther than any animal could. But at Millbrook Station, time moved like the plodding hoofs of his horse, steady, predictable, and going absolutely nowhere. He knew every crack in this platform. He could identify each imperfection in the weathered wood by touch alone. He knew the exact moment the early train would arrive, 6:47 a.m., never a minute later, never a minute earlier. He had learned this schedule so completely that his body had internalized it. His heart would begin to race at 6:40. His hands would unconsciously adjust the reins at 6:43, and by 6:45 he would be positioned exactly where he needed to be. He knew the telegraph operator by his gait, could recognize him 100 yards away by the particular shuffle of his left foot. He knew the baggage handler by his cough, a wet, rattling sound that came from years of smoking cheap cigars. He knew the station manager by the way he checked his pocket watch with a kind of obsessive precision that Michael recognized in himself. Michael's life was a perfectly cataloged collection of known quantities, filed away like books in a library where he was both the keeper and the prisoner. And that was precisely the problem. Sarah, his wife, had stopped asking about his dreams years ago. Not because Michael didn't have any. He had plenty of them. Dreams that haunted him in the darkness before dawn, dreams that would evaporate the moment consciousness returned. But Sarah had learned that asking only brought silence and a distant look in his eyes, the look of a man staring at something far away that he could never reach. She had learned to protect herself by not asking. 15 years of marriage had taught her that disappointment multiplies when you allow hope to take root. She worked as a seamstress, her fingers quick and precise with needle and thread, creating beauty from fabric that would eventually be worn by women who would never know her name, who would never think of the hands that had stitched their clothes with such care. They were partners in practicality, two people who had learned to be content with less, then had gradually become so accustomed to less that contentment seemed like an insult, a diminishment of what they might have been. Michael's horse, a dark brown mare named Duchess that he had owned for 12 years, stamped her hoof impatiently. She too had learned the rhythm of this place, the pattern of waiting and movement and waiting again. Michael ran his calloused hand down her neck, feeling the familiar warmth of her coat. Sometimes he wondered if Duchess was happier than he was, if horses had the capacity for such thoughts, or if they simply existed in the eternal present, never troubled by what might have been or what might still be. The morning was cold, the kind of cold that penetrates clothing and settles into bones, making a man feel every year of his life. Michael's breath came out in visible clouds. He adjusted his worn cap. It had been black once a few years ago, but now was a faded gray, and waited for the world to perform the same dance it had performed thousands of times before. The train whistle echoed across the valley at precisely 6:46 a.m. Michael knew the sound so well he could have written music to accompany it, a symphony of steam and metal and the compressed air that announced the arrival of the outside world into their small town. Right on schedule. The whistle faded into the distance as the train approached. Michael adjusted his posture, straightened his spine as much as his bent back would allow, and prepared himself for the familiar routine. The train pulled in with its usual grinding of metal on metal, the release of steam that smelled faintly of coal and hot water, the hiss and groan of brakes being applied. Michael had heard this sound thousands of times. He could have performed every motion of the next hour with his eyes closed. Passengers would exit, businessmen heading to the city in their dark suits, occasional families visiting relatives in other towns. Sometimes a traveling salesman carrying cases full of goods nobody particularly wanted or needed. Michael would load their bags with mechanical efficiency, negotiate the fare with people who rarely had the energy to haggle, and drive them to wherever they needed to go. Then he would return to the station and wait for the next train. Like a man caught in a loop, he never consented to enter, but could no longer imagine exiting. This morning, however, something was different. Michael felt it in the air before he could identify what it was. A subtle shift in the rhythm of the day, like when a musician hits a note that is just slightly off, not quite wrong enough to name, but wrong enough to disturb the ear. The man who descended from the third-class car was not remarkable to look at in any obvious way. He wore a dark coat that had been expensive once, perhaps 10 or 15 years ago, but was now showing its age in small, particular ways. The fabric was still good, but the color had faded slightly. The seams were still intact, but there was a tear in the lining visible at the right shoulder. His hair was graying at the temples, his face lined with the kind of wrinkles that come from laughing and crying in equal measure, from experiencing both the heights and the depths that life had to offer. But there was something about the way he moved, a deliberation, a careful consideration of each step, as if he was acutely aware that he was still alive to take it, that this simple act of walking from one place to another was something to be not taken for granted. Michael recognized this quality immediately. He had seen it before, years ago, in his father's eyes after a particularly brutal beating, that look of a man who had been broken and had learned to put the pieces back together differently than before, perhaps stronger in some ways, but forever marked by the break. "Are you available for hire?" the man asked. His voice was educated, carrying an accent of someone who had spent time in cities, who had moved in circles where such accents were currency. "I am," Michael replied simply. He had long ago learned that elaborate responses were unnecessary. Most passengers didn't actually want conversation. They wanted transportation. "How much to take me to the boarding house on Church Street, and I might need reliable transportation for the next 2 weeks. I'm here for some business matters that will require steady access to a carriage." Michael quoted his standard rate. The man nodded, without haggling, without even a moment of consideration. Michael had learned that truly wealthy people never negotiated with service workers. They simply paid what was asked. This immediate acceptance suggested the man was either very wealthy or very indifferent to money, or perhaps, most likely, something in between. "I'm Thomas," the man said during the short drive through the quiet morning streets. "In Millbrook for business, property acquisition for an investment group.
How long have you been driving?
20 years, sir. 20 years? In the same small town? Yes, sir. Do you enjoy it? The man asked the question casually, as if making simple conversation, but there was something in his tone that suggested he genuinely wanted to know the answer, that he was actually listening. It was an odd question. Michael had never been asked whether he enjoyed his work. Work provided food and shelter for him and his wife. It was a necessary thing, like breathing or sleeping. Enjoyment seemed like a luxury for people with choices, and Michael had learned long ago that choices were for other people born into different circumstances. It is honest work, Michael said finally, focusing on the horse and the road ahead, using the familiar evasion that had served him well for 2 decades. Thomas laughed, but not in a mocking way. It was the laugh of someone who recognized an evasion, who understood the mechanisms of avoidance because they had spent years perfecting their own evasions. That's not what I asked, but I understand why you answered that way. They drove in silence for the rest of the journey. At the boarding house, a modest building with white shutters and a sagging porch, Thomas gathered his 2 large suitcases from the back of the carriage. Before leaving, Thomas handed Michael an envelope, and when Michael opened it, inside was cash, 4 times the normal fare for a drive across town. I would like to hire you as my personal driver for my stay. I'll need transportation to various locations around Millbrook and possibly to nearby towns, but I have one condition. You must tell me the truth. All of it. No more.
No more evasions. Can you do that? Michael stared at the envelope. 4 times the normal fare could feed his family for a week and a half. It was more money than he usually made in 2 weeks. But something in Thomas's voice compelled him to nod despite his hesitation, despite the part of him that wanted to refuse and return to the safe predictability of his ordinary routes. "I'll be here at 7 tomorrow morning," Michael said. "That's fine. I'll be ready." When Michael told Sarah that night, sitting at their worn wooden table with the evening light fading through the small window of their modest home, something shifted in his wife's expression. She wasn't angry or afraid. Sarah was rarely either of those things anymore. But something flickered across her face like a candle flame catching wind. It was a recognition, perhaps, that her husband had encountered something that might change them both, that might alter the trajectory of their lives in ways neither of them could yet predict. "This man," Sarah said carefully, setting down the needle she had been using to stitch a hymn, "what does he want from you?" "I don't know yet," Michael admitted. He had never been good at lying to Sarah, and he didn't try now. "He wants me to be truthful. He said he hired me not just to drive him, but to talk to him, to tell him the truth about things. And you will do it, whatever it is?" Michael looked at his wife. After 15 years of marriage, they had settled into the comfortable silence of people who no longer expected much from each other, who had learned that expecting things only led to disappointment. They had built their life on the foundation of not expecting, not hoping, not reaching for anything beyond what they could safely hold. But in that moment, Michael saw something in Sarah's eyes that he thought had died years ago. Hope. Not hope that he would become rich or famous or successful in the world's terms, but hope that something in him might still be alive enough to want something, to reach for something, to take a chance. "I think I need to," he said. Sarah nodded slowly, and when she looked back down at her sewing, Michael saw that her hands were trembling slightly. "Then you should. And Michael, if you are going to change your life, I should know that I'm terrified. Terrified that you'll fail. Terrified that you'll succeed and leave me behind. Terrified that I've gotten comfortable with our small life and won't know how to live in a bigger one. But I'm more terrified that you won't try. I am more terrified that you will reach the end of your life and realize that you spent it waiting for something that never came." Michael reached across the table and took his wife's hand. It was thin and soft, worn from years of needlework, but still warm. "I don't know what this man wants from me exactly, but I know that something needs to change. I can feel it. I think I've always felt it."
For the first 3 days, Thomas had Michael drive him around Millbrook and the surrounding areas. But these were not simple trips from point A to point B. Thomas would have Michael stop at various businesses: a small mill on the outskirts of town, a blacksmith shop near the center square, a general store that had been operating for 40 years, a modest shipyard near the river that handled barge traffic and small vessel repairs. At each location, Thomas would disappear inside for anywhere from 30 minutes to 2 hours, conducting whatever business had brought him to their small town. Michael would wait with Duchess, feeding her carrots and apples he had brought, talking to her about nothing in particular, the way a man talks to an animal that will never judge him. But at the end of each day, when Thomas returned to the carriage, he would ask Michael to tell him something true, something real, something honest. Michael resisted at first. On the third day, when Thomas asked directly, "What are you afraid of?" Michael's initial response was the same evasion he had relied upon for 2 decades. "I'm not afraid of anything, sir. I'm a working man. I do my job. I take care of my wife. I've never missed a day of work in 20 years. Fear doesn't enter into it." Thomas smiled sadly, a smile that suggested he had heard this kind of deflection many times before and had long ago stopped being surprised by it. "That's not what I asked, Michael. I asked what you're afraid of. And we both know you gave me an evasion, not an answer. The question was simple and direct. Your answer was complex and evasive, which suggests that what you're afraid of matters to you very much." Michael gripped the reins tighter, his knuckles turning white. "I don't see how your fears are any of concern of yours, sir. I've hired you as a driver. That's what I'm doing." "You're right," Thomas replied, his voice gentle. "You've hired you as a driver, and I'm not disputing that you're doing the job well. But I didn't hire you just to drive me. I hired you because I saw something in you that I recognized from my own life. I saw a man who had given up on himself. And I hired you because I thought maybe, just maybe, I could help you stop doing that. So I'm asking you again, not as an employer, but as one human being to another, what are you afraid of?" For a long moment, Michael said nothing. The carriage rolled slowly through the quiet streets of Millbrook, the sound of Dutch's hoofs the only noise. Then Michael began to speak, and once he began, he could not stop. "I'm afraid that I've wasted 20 years. I'm afraid that it's too late to become anything other than what I am. I'm afraid that my wife deserves better than me, and that I've trapped her in this life with me. I'm afraid that if I try for something more, if I actually reach for something different, I'll fail. And then I won't even have the small comfort of knowing what I am now. I'll have tried and failed, and that will be worse than never trying at all." Thomas nodded slowly, as if he had confirmed something he already suspected. Those are legitimate fears, and they are exactly the kind of fears that keep good men from becoming great ones. But here's what I want to tell you. Fear is not evidence of impossibility. Fear is evidence that something matters. Something, deep inside you, something that hasn't died despite 20 years of trying to kill it. That something is afraid of what might happen if you actually tried to become more than you are.
By the end of the first week, Michael's evenings had transformed into something entirely different. Instead of sitting in silence with Sarah, barely speaking beyond the necessities of domestic life, Michael found himself talking to her about things he had never articulated before. He told her about his father, who had been a drunkard and a violent man, who had beaten Michael's mother until she left, who had spent his last years alone in a room, drinking himself to death while his son watched from a distance. He told her about how he had sworn never to be like his father, and how, in his caution, he had simply chosen a different kind of failure, the failure of a man who never tried, who built his life around the absence of risk and the presence of nothing. Sarah listened with an intensity that Michael had almost forgotten she possessed. She asked him questions, real questions that demanded real answers. She challenged him when he tried to retreat into evasion. She told him things about herself that he realized, to his shame, he had never bothered to ask about in all their years of marriage. "I wanted to study," Sarah told him one evening, as they sat in the darkness of their bedroom, the lamp burning low. I wanted to go to school and learn languages and literature. I wanted to read books and understand the world beyond Millbrook. My father wouldn't hear of it. Women didn't have such aspirations, he said. It wasn't proper. It wasn't practical. So I learned to sew, and that became my entire life. But I never blamed you for that, Michael. You gave me as much freedom as a man in your position could. What I blamed you for was giving up on your own dreams and expecting me to be happy with that sacrifice. What I blamed you for was treating contentment like a virtue when it was really just surrender. Michael had no response to this. The truth of it struck him like a physical blow, and he lay awake long into the night thinking about the ways he had failed his wife, not through deliberate cruelty, but through the passive violence of never trying, never asking for more, never believing that more was possible. On the 8th day of his employment with Thomas, something happened that would set in motion a chain of events that Michael could never have anticipated. Something that would become the first domino in a series of revelations that would ultimately reshape his understanding of everything. Thomas had been in a meeting with Harold Peterson, one of the most prominent businessmen in Millbrook, for nearly 2 hours. When he finally emerged from Peterson's office building, his expression was strange, something between anger and sadness, like a man who had just received news that he had both been dreading and expecting. Michael could tell something was wrong immediately. Thomas moved differently, his shoulders sagging slightly, his gaze unfocused as he walked toward the carriage. "Take me back to the boarding house," Thomas said abruptly, and there was an edge to his voice that hadn't been there before. They drove in silence. When they arrived at the boarding house, Thomas asked Michael to come inside for a moment. Michael hesitated. Such intimacy between a hired driver and his employer was highly unusual, something that crossed the invisible boundaries that govern the relationships between people of different stations. But something in Thomas's voice compelled him to comply, to leave the carriage, to follow Thomas inside. In Thomas's small room on the second floor, Thomas poured 2 glasses of whiskey from a bottle he pulled from his suitcase. He handed one to Michael, without explanation. Michael accepted it, though he rarely drank. "Harold Peterson," Thomas said, his voice measured and controlled in a way that suggested he was holding great emotion in check, "just told me something very interesting about you." Michael's stomach tightened. 1,000 possibilities raced through his mind, each one worse than the last. "He said that 3 months ago, you were involved in an incident with a cart carrying lumber. He said you struck his property line with your carriage, damaging his fence. He said you never paid for the repairs. He said you drove away as if nothing had happened, and you never returned to address the damage." Michael felt his face flush. It was true. It was completely, undeniably true. He had been navigating a particularly narrow street during a particularly crowded market day. His carriage had sideswept Peterson's fence. The damage was minor. A few boards loosened, a section of the fence tilted at an angle. Peterson had never asked him to pay for it. Michael had convinced himself that it had been an accident, that Peterson didn't care enough to pursue it, that acknowledging it would only make things awkward between them. So he had chosen not to acknowledge it. He had chosen to pretend it hadn't happened, and over the course of 3 months, he had largely succeeded. The memory had faded from prominence in his mind. "It was an accident," Michael began, his voice defensive. "I know it was. That's not the point. The point is what you did about it. What you did was nothing. You pretended it didn't matter because acknowledging it would have required you to take responsibility for something beyond your control. You preferred the comfort of avoidance to the discomfort of accountability. Do you understand what that makes you, Michael?" Michael shook his head slowly. "It makes you human," Thomas said, and his voice was kind, in a way that made Michael's shame worse.
It makes you like every other person who has ever convinced themselves that they could ignore their small failures and still be a good person. But here's the thing about those small failures. They compound. They become the patterns of your life. You fail in small ways enough times, and eventually you believe you're incapable of succeeding in any way. Thomas finished his whiskey. Tomorrow, I want you to go to Peterson. I want you to offer to pay for the fence repairs. Not because you owe him money, it's only a few dollars, and he's a rich man. I want you to do it because you owe yourself the experience of taking responsibility for your actions. Can you do that? Yes, sir, Michael said quietly.
Good. Now go home. Michael did it the next day. His hands were shaking as he approached Peterson's office. He had written out what he wanted to say, rehearsing it in his mind a dozen times. But when he actually faced Peterson, when he actually opened his mouth and told the man that he had been wrong, that he had damaged his fence and hadn't paid for it, when he actually offered money and apology, something unexpected happened. Peterson, a gruff man in his 60s with a weathered face and sharp eyes, looked at Michael with surprise, then with something that might have been respect. He told Michael that he had forgiven him months ago, that accidents happened, that Michael was one of the few working men in town that he had any respect for. He told Michael that he had been waiting to see if Michael would eventually step up and do the right thing, and now that Michael had, he had a proposition. His nephew was looking to start a small transportation business in Philadelphia, Peterson said. The nephew needed someone to manage the day-to-day operations, someone reliable and honest. Peterson thought Michael would be perfect for the position. The pay would be more than Michael made driving tourists around Millbrook. There would be potential for growth, for ownership even, if Michael proved reliable and capable over time. Michael had not accepted on the spot. He had driven back to find Thomas and told him what had occurred. Thomas smiled, the first genuine smile Michael had seen from him since arriving in Millbrook. Do you see what happened? You took a small action, admitting a small failure, and that action created a possibility. That's how change begins, Michael. Not with grand gestures or dramatic moments, with small acts of integrity that ripple outward in unexpected ways. Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time. So if you're enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
But on the night of the 10th day, everything changed. This time in a way that made Michael question everything he thought he understood about Thomas and about his own judgment in trusting this man. Michael had gone to the boarding house as usual to pick up Thomas for their morning drive. The boarding house keeper, Mrs. Chen, met him at the door with a worried expression. Her hands were wringing the edge of her apron, and her eyes darted between Michael and the stairs. "Your employer is not well," she said. "He asked me to tell you he cannot leave today. He asked me to tell you to come upstairs to room 207. Michael's heart rate increased. He had never been invited to see Thomas's private rooms. He climbed the stairs slowly, each step heavy with a sense of foreboding. What he found instead of an ill man was Thomas packing his belongings into his bags with urgent, jerky movements. His face was pale and his hand shook slightly as he moved between the dresser and the suitcase open on the bed. Clothing, books, papers, all being hastily thrown together without the care they deserved. "We're leaving," Thomas said, without preamble. "Right now. We need to get to the station within the hour. Pack whatever you absolutely need. Tell your wife to pack only essentials. We don't have much time." "Sir, what's happened? Are you ill? What's wrong?" "Not ill," Thomas said, stuffing a pair of shoes into the suitcase. "Discovered. Take me to the station immediately, and on the way I'll explain what I've done and why you're going to have to make a choice about whether to hate me for it. I need to be honest with you before we leave, even if honesty destroys everything between us." The carriage ride to the station took 15 minutes. In that time, Thomas told Michael a story that rewrote everything Michael thought he understood about the past 10 days. Thomas was not in Millbrook to purchase property. He had never been in Millbrook to purchase property. He was in Millbrook because he was running. 15 years earlier, Thomas had been involved in a business venture that had gone catastrophically wrong. A man named Abraham Coulter had lost his entire life savings as a result of Thomas's poor judgment and ethical compromises. Coulter had lost not just his money, but his home, his reputation, his ability to provide for his family. Rather than face the slow degradation of poverty, rather than watch his family suffer the consequences of his financial ruin, Abraham Coulter had taken his own life. He had walked into the river on a cold November evening and had not walked back out. Thomas had spent the next 15 years trying to make restitution to Abraham Coulter's widow and children. He had anonymously funded their education. He had anonymously paid their rent. He had sent money for clothing, for food, for necessities. But he had never looked them in the eye. He had never faced the full weight of what he had done. Eleanor Coulter, Abraham's widow, had never forgiven him. She had hired investigators to track his movements. She wanted more than money. She wanted Thomas to experience the same kind of loss and pain that she had experienced, the same desperation that had driven her husband to the river. And over the years, her desire for revenge had transformed into something more complicated, a need to force Thomas to acknowledge what he had done, to face the consequences of his actions in a direct and unavoidable way. Eleanor Coulter lived in Millbrook. She was married now to Harold Peterson. When Thomas had gone to meet with Peterson for what he thought was a business meeting related to property acquisition, Peterson had recognized something in Thomas, something in the way he moved, perhaps, or something Eleanor had told him. Peterson had confirmed his suspicions based on information Eleanor had provided. Peterson had sent word that Eleanor was coming to the boarding house. Thomas had been warned by a sympathetic maid at the boarding house who had witnessed Eleanor arriving in Peterson's carriage, who had understood that something momentous was about to occur. "I've been a coward," Thomas told Michael as the carriage pulled through the streets of Millbrook toward the station. "I've run from this for 15 years, and I'm running still. I can't face her. I can't look into the eyes of the woman whose husband I drove to suicide. I can't bear the weight of her anger and her grief. So I'm running. I'm abandoning my responsibility just as I always do. I'm choosing the comfort of escape over the discomfort of accountability." Michael felt something shift in his chest. He had been trying so hard not to see Thomas as someone with real depth, real pain, real flaws. It was easier to see him as just another passenger, another source of income, another transient figure in his life. But now he saw Thomas clearly, a broken man who had tried to teach Michael about integrity while failing to practice it himself. "Then don't run," Michael said, surprising himself with the strength in his voice. "Stay and face her. Tell her what you've told me. Tell her that you've acknowledged what you did, that you've lived with the weight of it for 15 years. Tell her that you've tried to make restitution. That might not erase what happened to her husband, but it might mean something. It might allow her to finally start healing instead of just festering in anger." "I'm not strong enough for that," Thomas said. "Then let me help you be strong enough for that. Let me help you face this. I'll go with you. I'll stand beside you while you tell her the truth." Thomas was quiet for a long moment. His hands had stopped shaking. He looked at Michael with something approaching anguish. He looked at Michael with an intensity that suggested he was seeing him for the first time, really seeing him, not as a driver or a student, but as a man who was willing to place his own life on hold to help someone else. Then Thomas said something that would later seem like the cruelest twist of fate, the moment when everything could have changed but didn't. "You're right. We should go back." Michael felt a surge of hope. He felt for just a moment that he had learned Thomas's lesson perfectly, that he had understood the point of everything Thomas had been teaching him. He was turning the carriage around, his hands already moving on the reins, when a messenger arrived at the station carrying an urgent telegram. The messenger handed it to Michael specifically, having traced him to the station. It was from Sarah. There had been a fire at their home. It had started in the kitchen. Michael's stove, which he had been meaning to repair for months, had finally failed catastrophically, sparking a fire that had quickly spread. Sarah had been burned while trying to extinguish it. She was alive, but she was hurt, and she needed Michael. The telegram was signed by their neighbor, who had helped bring Sarah to the doctor. Michael made a decision in an instant. He abandoned Thomas at the station with the money he owed him for the past 2 weeks of employment. He pressed additional money into Thomas's hands, most of what he had saved over the past few weeks, and told him that he had to go to his wife. He rushed home, leaving Thomas standing on the platform with his 2 suitcases and his unresolved past, leaving the man who had taught him about responsibility in the moment when Thomas most needed to practice that responsibility himself.
When Michael arrived at their house, Sarah was being treated by the doctor in their small bedroom. Her left arm and part of her side had been burned, the skin red and blistering. The smell of burned flesh filled the room, and Michael had to fight not to vomit. The doctor said that with proper care, and if infection didn't set in, she would recover fully, though she would bear scars for the rest of her life. The scars would be a permanent reminder of the moment when everything changed. Michael spent the next 3 days at her bedside, barely sleeping, barely eating, consumed with guilt and anxiety. He held Sarah's hand through the pain, helped her drink water when she was thirsty, changed the bandages that the doctor showed him how to change. He whispered apologies for not being there, for not fixing the stove earlier, for pursuing Thomas's mentorship when he should have been focused on maintaining his home and protecting his wife. On the 4th day, when Sarah was lucid enough for a real conversation, her voice still hoarse from the smoke she had inhaled, she asked him what had happened. Michael broke down and told her everything about Thomas and the mentorship, about the moment when he had been about to help Thomas face his past, about the fire that had made that decision for him. "You left him?" Sarah asked, and Michael detected no judgment in her voice, only curiosity. "He needed me to face his fears," Michael said. "I've failed him." "No," Sarah said quietly, reaching out, despite the pain, and taking his hand. "You chose me. You chose the immediate over the distant. You chose to care for your wife over helping a stranger face his demons. That's not failure, Michael. That's love. Don't diminish that by feeling guilty about it. A man can't be in 2 places at once. You chose correctly." "But everything he taught me is still true," Sarah finished. "Michael, listen to me. I'm lying here in pain, and the only thing that keeps me calm is knowing that you were driving that carriage thinking of me, that you chose to abandon your own desires to be here with me. Don't take that away from yourself. Don't rewrite that moment as a failure. That was integrity. That was you doing the right thing even when it costs you something." A week after the fire, as Sarah was slowly healing and Michael had returned to light work to support them, managing only short driving routes while spending most of his time helping Sarah recover, a letter arrived. It bore a Philadelphia postmark and was written in Thomas's careful handwriting. The letter began with an apology for the deception about his true purpose in Millbrook, but it continued with something unexpected, something that made Michael read it 3 times to ensure he understood correctly. After Michael had abandoned him at the station, Thomas wrote he had indeed considered boarding the train. He had stood on the platform with his 2 suitcases, watching the train pull in, watching other passengers board. He had gone so far as to purchase a ticket. He had climbed the steps to the train car. But something in Michael's words had stuck with him. A man can choose to be more than his circumstances. You have to be strong enough to face what you've run from.
Those words had echoed in Thomas's mind as he stood in the train car, surrounded by strangers heading away from Millbrook, away from responsibility, away from pain. And instead of boarding the train, he had gotten off. He had returned to the station platform and had ripped up his ticket. He had gone to find Eleanor. He had not asked for forgiveness. He had not tried to minimize what he had done or appeal to her sympathy. He had simply told her the truth about what Abraham Coulter's death had cost him, about the 15 years of penance that had never felt sufficient, about how he had finally met someone who had shown him what real courage looked like. He had told her that if she wanted to press charges, he would not run. If she wanted to see him ruined, he would not resist. He simply wanted to know that her husband's death had not been meaningless. It had changed him, and through him was changing others. Eleanor Coulter had wept, but they were not tears of anger, Thomas wrote. They were tears of release, of finally being allowed to let go of the hatred that had consumed her for 15 years. She had told Thomas about the years of anger, about how the hatred had poisoned her second marriage, and about how harboring that rage had become a prison more confining than any actual jail cell. She had said that she did not know if she could forgive him, but she no longer wanted to destroy him. His admission of guilt and his willingness to face her.
1 month after the fire, when Sarah's wounds had scabbed over and she could move her arm without crying out in pain, Michael and Sarah boarded a train to Philadelphia. The city loomed ahead of them as they approached, full of possibility and danger in equal measure. Michael was terrified. The city was so much larger than Millbrook, so much noisier and faster and more complicated. But he was also, for the first time in 20 years, truly alive. He could feel it in his chest, a quickening of his heart, a sense that his life was no longer predetermined, that choices he made would matter. Thomas met him at the station in Philadelphia. He looked different, younger somehow, unburdened, in a way that suggested the weight he had been carrying had finally been lifted. He embraced Michael, then Sarah, and there was genuine warmth in the gesture. "You came," Thomas said. "I wasn't sure you would." "I came," Michael replied. "My wife convinced me that the past few weeks had taught me what I needed to learn. It was time to put that learning into practice." 3 months into his new position, Michael had built something that resembled success. The transportation business was growing. New clients were arriving regularly. Investors who had initially been skeptical were becoming confident. Michael had proven himself capable of managing the complex logistics of moving goods across the city, of negotiating with difficult dock workers and warehouse managers, of solving problems with a combination of creativity and diplomacy that seemed to come from somewhere deep within him that he didn't know existed. But success came with a price that Michael had not anticipated. The business belonged to Charles, Peterson's nephew, who was 28 years old and carried himself with the arrogance of a man who had never had to work for anything he possessed. Charles had inherited his uncle's shrewd business sense, but not his conscience, not his sense of responsibility to the people he employed and the clients he served. Charles had begun implementing practices that made Michael's stomach churn. He was underpaying workers, paying them less than had been agreed upon, telling them that the market was down, that their wages needed to be adjusted, and then threatening to replace them with cheaper labor when they complained. He was bribing city inspectors to ignore safety violations in the warehouses, violations that could have killed workers if any of the unstable structures had collapsed. He was cheating clients on deliveries, substituting cheaper goods and pocketing the difference, claiming that the quality was identical when it was demonstrably not. Michael had witnessed this kind of corruption before in his years driving in small-town America, but he had always been peripheral to it, a driver, a servant, someone who did not have the power to affect the outcome.
Now, as manager with responsibility for hiring and operations, he had authority, and with that authority came responsibility. When Michael first complained to Charles about these practices, Charles laughed and called him naive. "This is how real business works. You're not in Millbrook anymore, Michael. The quaint rules of small-town morality don't apply in the city. The people don't care about your ethics. They care about whether you can deliver what they pay for at a price they're willing to pay. If you can do it cheaper by cutting corners, then you cut corners. That's business." Michael went home that night and told Sarah what was happening. Their apartment was small but clean, and Sarah had already begun to make it into a home, despite her healing wounds still causing her pain. "What are you going to do?" she asked. She was stitching something, a small quilt, her hands moving with the automatic precision of years of needlework. And Michael, staring out at the city lights from their small apartment window, felt the weight of the choice before him. He could ignore the corruption. He could tell himself that it was not his responsibility, that he was just an employee, that Charles owned the business and could run it however he wanted. The money was good. His salary had doubled since arriving in Philadelphia. The work was better than driving in Millbrook. He and Sarah had a real future here, or at least the beginning of one. They could save money. They could build something. Or he could do what Thomas had taught him. He could face his fear and take responsibility for his actions. "I'm going to go to Thomas," Michael said finally. "I'm going to tell him what's happening, and then I'm going to let him decide what to do about it. But before that, I'm going to give Charles a choice. I'm going to tell him directly that what he's doing is wrong, and I'm going to give him the opportunity to change course. If he doesn't, then I have to report him. I have to, Sarah. I don't have any other choice." "Yes, you do," Sarah said quietly. "You always have a choice, but this is the right choice." What Michael didn't know was that Thomas had his own reasons for caring deeply about Charles's business practices. Eleanor Coulter, Abraham Coulter's widow, had mentioned in several of her letters to Thomas that she had observed similar unethical practices in her second husband's business over the years. She'd raised concerns to Harold Peterson about his nephew's conduct, but Harold, now aging and increasingly detached from the day-to-day operations, had dismissed her worries as the concerns of a woman who didn't understand business. When Michael came to Thomas with his concerns, Thomas did something that Michael had not expected. He took Michael to meet Eleanor. Eleanor Coulter was a woman in her late 60s now, with silver hair worn up in an elegant style, and eyes that had seen too much pain and too much anger. She moved slowly, as if carrying the weight of all those years of grief and rage in her body. She looked at Michael with an intensity that made him deeply uncomfortable, an intensity that suggested she was looking through him, past him, at something he couldn't see. "My husband was supposed to make this business better," Eleanor said, referring to her marriage to Harold Peterson. "I married him thinking that if I could help him understand ethics and responsibility, then maybe some good would come from the ruins of my first marriage. I thought that through him, through his nephew's business, I could ensure that other families didn't experience what I experienced, that I was naive. Harold loves his nephew, and his nephew is corrupt and greedy, and nothing I say will change that." Thomas stepped in. "Eleanor, Michael has come to me because he's observed the same kinds of practices you've been concerned about, and I've asked Michael to help me with something. Before I do it, I want you to know about it. I want everyone involved to understand what's happening and why. I have documentation of Charles's fraud. I have evidence of his bribery of city officials. I can go to the authorities and have him prosecuted. But before I do that, I want to give Michael a choice. I want to treat him as a moral agent, not just as an employee. I want him to have input into what happens next." Thomas turned to Michael. "I've been given a second chance at life, Michael, because you refused to let me waste it, because you stood in front of me and told me I had to face what I'd been running from. I'm offering you the same choice now, but I'm framing it differently. Here's my question. Do you believe Charles's practices are wrong enough to warrant exposure, or do you think there's another way? Because if you believe there's another way, I want to hear it." Michael felt as if he was being tested, and he was. This was Thomas's real lesson to Michael. It wasn't enough to identify wrongdoing. It wasn't enough to have good intentions. The real test was whether Michael had the courage to actually do something about it, knowing that the consequences might affect him directly, might cost him his job, his reputation, his livelihood.
"I think they're wrong," Michael said slowly, choosing his words with the care he had learned was necessary when facing serious decisions. "And I think they will continue to be wrong unless someone stops them. But I also think that if you expose Charles with my cooperation, people will say that I was motivated by revenge or ambition. I don't want my integrity to be questioned. I don't want people to doubt my motives." "Then what do you propose?" Eleanor asked. Her voice was softer now, and Michael realized that she had been waiting her whole life to hear someone propose an alternative to revenge and retribution. "I propose that I first try to convince Charles to change his practices," Michael said. "I will document every unethical practice I observe. I will request a formal meeting with Charles. I will present my documented list of concerns. I will be very clear about the ethical problems with what he's doing and the legal consequences he's exposing himself to. I will give him the opportunity to correct course. I will make clear that if these practices continue, I will have to report him to the authorities independently, without your involvement, without Thomas's involvement. I will take full responsibility for the report. And then if he refuses, I will do it alone." Thomas and Eleanor exchanged a look that Michael couldn't quite read. Then Thomas nodded. "That's good, Michael. That's the choice of a man who has truly learned something about responsibility and about what integrity actually means." Michael approached Charles the next day with a written list of the unethical practices he had documented over the past 3 months. He explained to Charles exactly why each practice was wrong, not just from a legal standpoint, but from an ethical one. He told Charles about the workers who were struggling because of reduced wages. He told Charles about the safety violations that could result in workers being injured or killed. He told Charles about the clients who were receiving inferior goods and being charged full price. He told Charles that these practices were not business. They were fraud and theft and reckless endangerment. He told Charles that if these practices continued, Michael would have to report them to the authorities. Charles's response was immediate and vicious. He fired Michael on the spot. More than that, he told Michael that he would make sure Michael was blacklisted in the Philadelphia business community. He claimed that Michael had been stealing from the company. He told his associates that Michael was unstable and unreliable, that he had a history of conflict with employers, that his background was questionable. He weaponized his Uncle Harold's connections to ensure that Michael would have a hard time finding work anywhere in the city. For a terrifying week, Michael believed that he had made a catastrophic mistake. He and Sarah had little savings. With his reputation destroyed, he couldn't find work. No one would hire him. Business owners would shake their heads when he asked for positions. Michael spent the days walking through Philadelphia, inquiring at warehouses and shipping companies and transportation businesses, only to be turned away. The desperation he felt was almost as bad as anything he had experienced, worse in some ways because he had voluntarily chosen to step off the cliff, had known the risks and had chosen integrity anyway, and now was facing the consequences of that choice. Sarah's words echoed in his head during those dark days. A man can't be in 2 places at once. You chose correctly. But correct or not, he was running out of money. Correct or not, he was failing to provide for his wife. But then something unexpected happened. Eleanor and her husband Harold, who had finally seen the evidence of Charles's corruption with his own eyes, evidence that Eleanor had been gathering quietly for months, forced Charles out of the business. They had confronted Charles with documentation that Eleanor had compiled, and Charles had panicked and made mistakes that revealed the extent of his embezzlement.
Harold, who had been in denial about his nephew's character for years, finally faced the truth. They hired Michael back, this time with a contract that gave him not just a salary, but a percentage of the profits, and promised protections against retaliation. They also went to the authorities, and Charles faced prosecution for fraud and bribery. He was convicted and spent 3 years in prison. More importantly, they used their social connections to repair Michael's reputation. Within a month, Michael was not just employed again, he was respected. He had become known as the man who had risked everything for his principles. New clients specifically requested to work with the company because they knew Michael was in charge, because they knew he would be honest with them.
6 months after the incident with Charles, Michael sat across from Thomas in a restaurant in downtown Philadelphia. This was the first time they had met alone since Michael had left Millbrook nearly 2 years before. Thomas looked older than Michael remembered, or perhaps Michael had just never really looked at him closely enough before. There was a fragility to Thomas now, something worn away by age and by the weight of carrying his conscience for so many years. "I want to tell you something," Thomas said, and his voice was weaker than it had been in Millbrook. "And I want you to listen carefully, because this is the most important thing I will ever tell you about how the world really works. Everything I taught you about taking responsibility, about facing your fears, about choosing integrity over comfort, all of that was true. But I left out one crucial element, and I left it out because I didn't fully understand it until I saw you live it." Michael waited, watching Thomas carefully. "The truth is, Michael, doing the right thing doesn't always lead to success. Sometimes it leads to ruin. Sometimes a good man makes the moral choice and gets destroyed for it. I had never lived long enough in the aftermath of a moral choice to see whether it would actually be rewarded or punished by the world. I had spent my life running from consequences, so I never got to see if the moral choice would ultimately vindicate itself. I believed it should, but I had never seen the evidence with my own eyes. But it did." Michael said, "Charles went to prison. The business is better now. Everything worked out." "Yes," Thomas agreed, "this time. But that's not guaranteed, Michael. And that's the crucial point that I didn't understand until I watched you live it. You made the right choice knowing full well that it might destroy you. You knew that Charles might succeed in blacklisting you. You knew that you might end up unemployed and unable to provide for Sarah. You made the moral choice anyway, not because you were guaranteed success, but because it was the right choice. That's the real lesson. That's where true integrity lives. Not in making the moral choice because it will ultimately reward you, but in making it even if it won't reward you, even if it will ruin you." Michael understood then what Thomas was truly saying. Thomas had been testing him to see if Michael understood that true morality is not transactional, not a calculation of inputs and outputs. You don't do the right thing to get a reward. You do it because it's right. You do it because you are the kind of man who does the right thing, regardless of whether the universe rewards that decision. "But there's something else I need to tell you," Thomas continued, and his voice took on a different quality, something heavier and more complex. "Something I should have told you from the beginning of all this. Something that might change how you think about everything that's happened." Michael felt a chill run down his spine. He sensed that this was a moment of significance, a moment where the narrative he had constructed about his own life and his relationship with Thomas might be fundamentally altered. "I didn't come to Millbrook by accident. I came there deliberately. Eleanor wrote to me and asked me to come. She told me about a small town where her husband had a small nephew with a growing transportation business. She told me about the corruption she suspected, the unethical practices she had observed. She asked me if I could help her investigate. She specifically asked me to find a way to get someone inside the business who had integrity, someone who could be trusted to do the right thing, even if it cost them everything." Michael's hands went cold. "You came to Millbrook looking for someone?" "I came looking for someone, yes, but I didn't find what I was looking for. I found you. And you were better than what I was looking for, Michael. You were someone who didn't just have integrity on the surface.
You had genuine confusion about your own worth. You genuinely believed that you might be incapable of more. That made you real. That made you someone I could actually help, not just someone I could use. You used me, Michael said, quietly. The words sat heavy in the air between them. I did, Thomas admitted without hesitation, but not in the way you're thinking. I used your potential. I recognized something in you that you couldn't see in yourself, and I created circumstances that forced you to confront yourself. Yes, some of that was calculated, but the connection between us was real, Michael, and everything I taught you was true. My methods might have been manipulative, but my intentions were good. I genuinely believed that you were capable of becoming more than you were, and I wanted to help you get there. But why tell me this now? Why not just let me believe that our meeting was serendipitous? Why not let me keep that innocence? Thomas leaned back in his chair, and Michael could see the effort it took for him to breathe, the way his hand went to his chest as if in pain. Because I'm dying, Michael. The doctors have given me 6 months, perhaps a year. Cancer, they say, eating away at my insides. And I wanted you to know the truth about how you came to be in Philadelphia, how you came to this place where you've become something better than you were. I wanted you to know that sometimes in life, we are manipulated by people we trust for reasons that seem good to us at the time, and we have to decide whether we can forgive that manipulation when the results of it are positive. Michael felt the world tilt beneath him. He thought about all of this, about Thomas, about the mentorship, about the way Thomas had guided him toward this moment. He thought about whether it mattered whether Thomas had come to Millbrook looking for him or had found him by accident. He thought about the truth of his journey was diminished by the knowledge that it had been orchestrated, at least in part, by someone else's designs. "Can I ask you something?" Michael said finally. "Of course. Ask me anything." "If Charles had been not corrupt, if he had been a good man, operating an ethical business, would you have had me report him anyway? Would you have fabricated evidence just to prove a point, to create a moral test that you could watch me pass or fail?" Thomas met his gaze directly, and Michael saw in his eyes the understanding that this was the question that mattered most, the question that would determine whether Michael could genuinely forgive him. "No," Thomas said firmly, "I would never do that. My mission was to find someone who could stop genuine corruption. If there had been no corruption, I would have simply paid you for your time and moved on. I would have helped you learn about integrity and responsibility in other ways. I would not have manufactured a moral crisis. The world provides enough real crises without anyone needing to create artificial ones. I am not a good enough man to resist temptation if I placed myself in that position, so I protected myself by refusing to do it. And I would like to think that I would have been honest with you if you had asked, as you just did." "Then I forgive you," Michael said. The words came from somewhere deep within him, from a place that had learned about forgiveness, not from philosophy, but from living through it. Not because the manipulation didn't happen, but because the manipulation was in service of something real. You didn't make Charles corrupt. You didn't fabricate a moral crisis. You simply recognized that corruption and found someone who could stop it. You believed in me before I believed in myself. That's a gift, Thomas, even if it came wrapped in deception. Thomas's eyes filled with tears. "Thank you for that, Michael, more than you know."
2 years after meeting Thomas, Michael stood once again at Millbrook Station. Thomas had died 8 months earlier, peacefully in his sleep, having made his peace with Eleanor and with himself. Michael had been at his funeral. So had Eleanor. So had Sarah. They had all wept for the complicated, broken man who had somehow, in the last years of his life, managed to help others become better versions of themselves. Michael was no longer a driver. He had become a manager, then a partner, and finally, partial owner of a successful transportation business that had expanded to 3 cities. He had hired dozens of workers and treated them fairly, ensuring they were paid well above the minimum standard, ensuring they worked in safe conditions, ensuring that their concerns were heard and addressed.
He had turned down several lucrative opportunities that required ethical compromise. He had become exactly the kind of man that Thomas had suggested he could become. But when Thomas's will was read, it contained something unexpected. Thomas had left Michael a property in Millbrook, a modest building that had once housed a small warehouse. Along with the property was a letter, written in Thomas's hand, dated just weeks before his death. The letter read, "Michael, by the time you read this, I will be gone. I have left you a property in Millbrook because I want you to know that your journey is not complete. You have learned to be a good man in the context of success and urban sophistication. You have learned to resist corruption and to stand by your principles when your livelihood was at stake. But the real test of your character will come when you return to the place where you started and have to decide whether to stay there or move forward. I leave you with this final lesson. The man who drove a carriage at Millbrook Station for 20 years was not a failure. He was a man who had not yet been tested. But now you have been tested. Now you have faced corruption and resisted it. Now you have faced manipulation and forgiven it. Now you have to decide what kind of life you want to live. If you choose to come back to Millbrook, use this property to build something good. A school, perhaps, or a place where people can learn trades and build their own businesses. If you choose to stay in Philadelphia, that is also right. The choice itself is what matters. You have become the man you were meant to be, Michael. Now, live like it." Sarah had wept when Michael told her about Thomas's death and his final letter. She had grown fond of Thomas over the years, despite his manipulations, despite the complexity of his character. She had seen what he had done for Michael, and she understood that Thomas had been looking for redemption in helping others change their lives. Now, standing at Millbrook Station, with Sarah beside him, Michael thought about the man he had been, and the man he had become. He thought about the choice before him. He could return to Philadelphia and continue building his transportation business. The business was thriving. His reputation was strong. He had made good money. He and Sarah had achieved a level of financial security that most people never reach. Or he could use Thomas's inheritance to return to the place where it had all begun and build something different, something that would benefit not just himself and his family, but his entire community. Sarah stood beside him, her hand in his. The scars from the fire had faded significantly, but never disappeared completely. They reminded Michael every day of the choice he had made to care for her over his own ambition, of the moment when everything could have changed, but didn't because he chose love over advancement. "What do you want to do?" Sarah asked. She had learned over the years that when Michael was at a crossroads, he needed to hear the question asked aloud, needed to articulate his thoughts in response to someone he trusted. Michael looked out at the platform, at the place where he had stood every day for 20 years, waiting for other people's journeys to begin. He thought about Thomas and Eleanor and Charles. He thought about the choices that had led him here. He thought about the man he had been, content with nothing, afraid of everything, convinced of his own insignificance. "I want to build a school," Michael said finally, "a place where people like we were, people who have been told their whole lives that they're not capable of more, that their circumstances are permanent, that they should simply accept their lot, can learn to believe in themselves. I want to teach them that integrity is not a luxury for the wealthy, it's a foundation that anyone can build upon. I want them to learn that a single choice, a single moment of courage, can change an entire trajectory." Sarah squeezed his hand. "Then that's what we'll do." 3 years later, the Millbrook Technical Academy opened its doors to students from throughout the region. It was a simple building, nothing fancy or pretentious. The walls were painted white, the classrooms were filled with honest wooden desks and chairs, the library contained books donated from universities in the city. But inside, young people learned trades and business practices from instructors who had lived through genuine hardship and genuine transformation. They learned about integrity not as an abstract concept, but as a practical tool for building lives of meaning and purpose.
Many of them went on to start their own businesses. Many others became teachers themselves, spreading the gospel of integrity and personal responsibility to the next generation. Michael ran the school with Sarah's help. He was not a wealthy man. Much of his profits went back into the school, into scholarships for poor students, into improvements to the facilities. But he was a happy man. He had never achieved the level of financial success that Philadelphia had offered him, but he had achieved something he valued more. A life aligned with his principles, a life that had meaning beyond the accumulation of money and status. On the 5th anniversary of the school's opening, Eleanor came to visit. She was an old woman now, her hair completely white, her movements slower with each passing year, but her eyes still held that same intensity, that same capacity to see through the surface of things to what lay beneath. She walked through the academy with Michael, observing the students working, learning, growing, discussing business ideas and moral philosophy with instructors who cared about them. Thomas would have been proud, Eleanor said. He would have. But I think what would have made him most proud is that I'm not just repeating his lessons. I'm creating something new from them. I'm showing that transformation is possible, not just for individuals, but for communities. I'm creating an environment where people can learn that they are capable of more, that their circumstances are not their destiny, that a single choice can set them on a different path. Eleanor smiled. That's the real mark of integrity, Michael. Not following in someone else's footsteps, but using what you've learned to forge your own path. Thomas understood that. That's why he chose you. Michael looked back at the Millbrook station, visible in the distance from the academy's windows. He thought about the man who had stood on that platform every morning, convinced that his life was predetermined, that change was impossible, that he was trapped by circumstance and by his own limitations. That man seemed like a stranger to him now, yet he was grateful for him. He was grateful for the man who had been broken enough to recognize an opportunity for transformation when it arrived. He was grateful for the man who had been hungry enough, desperate enough, ready enough to accept help when it came. The final lesson Thomas had taught him was this: we are not imprisoned by our circumstances. We are only imprisoned by our belief that we cannot change them. And sometimes all it takes to break free is one person who believes in us enough to show us what's possible. One person willing to take a risk on us when we haven't yet learned to take risks on ourselves. Michael had become that person for others, and in doing so, he had finally completed his own transformation from a man who drove carriages through a small town to a man who helped others navigate the carriage of their own lives towards destinations they had never dared to imagine. That was not a grand ending, but it was a real one, and in the end, that was what mattered most.
Up next, 2 more incredible stories are waiting for you right on your screen. If you enjoyed this one, you won't want to miss these. Just click to watch and don't forget to subscribe.